Welcome back to the Reviving Christian Families podcast. I am so excited that we are starting this trauma series together, guys. And I think it's going to be so beneficial for everyone who has, dealt with these traumatic events. And that's probably why most of you guys are here and you want to learn how to heal this with your spouse. So that's really what we're going to dive deep on over these coming weeks. So I'm so excited, and let's dive into today's episode.
Hey, spouses. I know what it's like to be frazzled, overwhelmed, and stressed while managing all the tasks, balancing work schedules, raising children, and trying to grow closer to each other and the Lord. All the trauma and the shame cycles you can't seem to break out of are just the cherry on top, right? You know that you want to make a change, that you need something to be different, and you crave a happier, healthier lifestyle, but you don't know where to start, how to get there, and you just feel stuck. That's why I'm here showing up every week with these podcast episodes to give you the knowledge and momentum you need to get unstuck and begin healing the generational trauma in your family. Let's take off those trauma patterns and the lies of the enemy and put on the armor and strength of the Lord. We are building a better future for the next generation and every generation to come. And the healing for the next generations begins with us. So, wives, grab your husband, and husbands, grab your wife a snack, and let's dive in and do the work.
Okay, so we're going to start today by just kind of defining what trauma actually is. And to start here, I want to say something that I heard from another podcast where a guest speaker was on, and I believe she was a psychologist, and she specializes in this area of trauma and working with people who have been through highly traumatic things. And she kind of gave her definition of trauma, and she said it in a way that I thought was so eloquent and simple. And so I want to kind of reiterate that to you guys. And she pretty much said that trauma is anything that your brain doesn't understand, because the brain has a need to understand, and it has a need to be able to process data, and because that's part of how it keeps you safe, right? Like we talk a lot about how your brain is always trying to protect you, and your brain can't protect you if it doesn't understand something. And so I think, like, just looking at my own life, and probably if you were to like look at yours too, you would see that that makes so much sense. Like, the things that bother us the most are always like, I just can't understand why that happened or why they did that, or and so I loved that definition. I wanted to share that with you guys, but I also am going to share like the textbook definition if you were to like Google it. And when you like look up the definition, it says trauma is defined as a deeply distressing or disturbing event that overwhelms a person's coping abilities and results in significant psychological or physical harm. And then it kind of like gives subcategories here that, it could be a direct experience where you are witnessing or experiencing something like life threatening or, terrifying. It could be indirect, and it's like, learning about a traumatic event that happened to someone close to you, or, like just in detail hearing about something that was highly traumatic. And then there's repeated events or exposures where you're constantly witnessing these events happening or constantly being involved in it, having it happen to you. And so that's kind of like the different subcategories for that. But I actually had a lot more, like, I guess you could call them subcategories. They're just what are like the different types of trauma. And so we're going to talk about that too. So first, there's like this idea of big T versus little t. And so a big T trauma would be like a life-threatening event or situation. So it could be a natural disaster, a war, a violent crime, something along those lines. And then a little t trauma would be something that may not be considered traumatic by society, or like not widely recognized, but still has an effect, a negative effect on someone. So that could be like a breakup, a divorce, financial troubles, like that type of stuff. And when I was kind of diving into this more, there was some other terms that are kind of similar to what we've discussed already, but they kind of like break this down even further. And so there's acute trauma, which is defined as a single, sudden, and overwhelming event that causes significant distress and fear. And some of the examples of that would be like car accidents, natural disasters, a sexual assault, or witnessing of violence. And then there's another one that is chronic trauma, and this is repeated exposure to like a stressful or traumatic event over an extended amount of time. And this could look like domestic violence, child abuse, war, or some type of prolonged illness. And then there is complex trauma, and this is when you have multiple overlapping and interconnected traumatic experiences that occur over time. This could be like some type of interpersonal violence, neglect, or abuse. And then there's developmental trauma, and this is anything that was experienced during early childhood development, which could, have a long-term effect on the brain development and mental health. And so then it also goes down and breaks it down even further by saying that, there might be witnessing trauma, where you experience trauma by observing a traumatic event happening to someone else. And then there's vicarious trauma, which is developing symptoms of trauma after hearing about or caring for someone who experienced a traumatic event. There is intergenerational trauma, which we talk a lot about on the podcast, right? That's like one of our main things. And that's just trauma passed down from parents to children through generations. And we kind of talked about this in past episodes, but I just want to retouch on it here in case you didn't listen to like the first few episodes, and say that there is like two sides to this coin. And there's like the scientific like passing of certain things through actual like biological childbirthing, like they get certain things from you that are just kind of passed on to them through the process of like them being in the womb. And so that is a real thing. Like there is some trauma that is like stored in the DNA in the brain, like those type of things that are like very internal, that can actually be passed to the baby. And so there's that side of the coin, but there's also the other side where it's habitual, right? Like you learn these habits and these patterns that maybe stemmed from the trauma, that maybe you learned from your parents, or it was just like became how you coped and how you lived, based off of, what was life like after that traumatic event. And so a lot of it can also be just learned, because children learn from watching their parents. The whole do what I say, not what I do thing, it doesn't work the way that we want it to, because as humans, like we can hear, but we can also see. And so if what we're hearing doesn't match what we're seeing, there's going to be a disconnect, and it's going to be hard to learn that thing. So I just wanted to touch on that, so that when we're moving forward, you can kind of have that in mind. Like there is a biological side to it, and there's also a learned side of it. So, not to sit here and argue nature versus nurture, but yeah, I just wanted to point that out because I thought that was important. And so the last thing I have here is a societal trauma, which is a large-scale traumatic event that like affected a whole area or whole community or whole population. And that could look like pandemics, wars, really anything devastating that happened to a whole group of people at once. So, now that we've kind of talked about that and broken all that down, I think it's really important to really kind of take a second here and digest what we just learned, which we're going to kind of do through practical application. So I want you to really ask yourself if there was anything that you kind of identified with in that. And the important thing to remember here is I'm not asking you to fit into one of those categories. Like for you, it may be multiple things, and they may be big, they may be small. It's not really about the size of the traumatic event, because even seemingly small events can have really big impacts in your life over time and really big impacts on your mental health. So maybe, like your small event was just having a moment where, maybe you grew up thinking one thing and then you learned that that wasn't true. There was like some, you found out there was some miscommunication or something that your parents were keeping from you until you were older. And so you have that moment of like, wow, like that flipped my world upside down. It was like a little dramatic. And I think that when we have those small traumas, we can kind of almost feel like they're insignificant compared to like the big T's, especially if we're seeing a lot of like bigger traumas in even our lives or people around us lives, where we're like, well, that doesn't even compare to that. But that's not the point. Like, we're not trying to compare it, because the thing is, it's not a singular isolated incident, right? These events, they add up over time. And so as we go through life and we experience more things, and we go through various challenges, the little traumas will add up, and then the big traumas are adding on top of that. So what I kind of want you to do, and this is like kind of your homework, quote unquote, is I want you guys to actually sit down and I want you to map out like all of the things that you would say are traumatic for you. And so I don't want you guys to get stuck in like trying to make this perfect. Like, no, this is going to be messy. You might forget things, and have to add them in later. It's like, it doesn't matter. It's just like, we need to get started. So what I want you to do is to find a piece of paper and a pencil or a pen, and I want you to just start writing down all of the things that have like affected you in a negative way. Even if it was very small. No matter how small, no matter how big, just write them all down. They don't need to be in order yet. We're just kind of getting them all out on this piece of paper. And so I want you to pause that and do that. Pause this and do that. Okay, now pause it. Okay, now if you're still here, I'm assuming that you already paused it and did it. And so let's hope that's true. If not, you need to re-add this to your list to come back later and listen again. And so now that we've like brain dumped all the things, I want you guys to now go in and kind of create a timeline. So you get to decide how you want to do this. I'm going to give you 2 options because I don't want to overwhelm you. And so I want you to just pick from one of these 2. You can either make this list form, and you can kind of lightly write out years and then just kind of group things in years and just write it in a list, but in order this time. Or you can create like a actual timeline, and kind of put things on your life timeline where they would fit in. So those are your 2 options. I want you to pick one, and I want you to go do that now. So pause this and go do it. Okay. All right. I'm hoping that you did that and that you're back now from your homework. And if you're like listening to this in the car or something and you're like, I absolutely can't pause it, that's okay. But like, seriously, do come back to this because it's important that this is top of mind when you're doing it, right? Like, I don't want you to listen to this episode and then completely, go throughout your day and then try to do it and you hardly remember anything we talked about. So it's important to do it close to the time you're listening to this, if possible. All right. And so then, now that we've kind of talked about the different types of trauma and what trauma is, I want to kind of talk a little bit about how it impacts you, like in your body, in your mind, in your relationships, and then we'll kind of touch on like the healing part of it. And so, we've kind of talked about how these traumas, the different types and what they kind of look like. And so hopefully you maybe resonated with some of those examples and can start to, think of more. But what we often don't think about is that even the little things, I mean, especially the big things, but even the little things can impact us just in our day to day. And that's because, the body really does keep the score. And that's an amazing book. If you guys are interested in like learning more, I believe that in this series later, we're going to have a whole episode just like talking about this more. And I'm going to kind of like talk about the main points of what I learned from the book and stuff. And so definitely be looking for that episode. But I really want to kind of just give the overview here of what does this impact in our body and our mind and our relationships look like. And so I want to kind of give an example from someone that I know was like in my life growing up, and she kind of never escaped the cycle of behavior that she witnessed. So she grew up in a home where her parents were split, and she had like witnessed drug abuse, witnessed alcohol abuse. She had witnessed like unhealthy relationships. Like her mom was constantly getting in and out of relationships and going through like abusive ones. And she never really was able to get an example of what a healthy relationship looked like, or, kind of see what even healthy functioning on a day-to-day level would look like, because everyone around her was kind of operating off of some kind of addiction, or just like had all these unhealthy patterns and behaviors that they brought into their own lives, maybe from their parents, or just things that they learned to cope with whatever they struggled with in life. So she kind of learned all that stuff. She also had a health issue where, she's like kind of just losing strength over time, and there's really no cure. And so she would deal with the pain a lot she got a medical card for weed before, it was even legal. And so now where she lives, it is legal. But even before that, she had her medical card. So she was, using it. And she ended up in a very unhealthy relationship, which turned into a unhealthy marriage. The man was abusive, and she had multiple kids with him. He then went on to hit on her little sister, and then beyond that, she stayed with him after that. And then there was a situation where he had kind of been abusive, and I didn't know all the details, but I know that he got locked up, and he ended up getting out, and she let them back into their lives. And then she was ready to be done with him at one point because he had ran away with a very young girl who I believe might have been under 18. and like took her out of state lines and like just literally ran away with her. And so she was like abandoned and she was kind of over it. And she got to a point where she said she was ready to leave and she moved to a different state. I mean, she really like seemed to be taking steps to change things for the better, but it didn't stick. And as soon as he came back, she went back to him. And so maybe you know someone whose story is like this, or maybe even your story has been like this. And what I'm trying to point out here is that there was an effect on her because she never witnessed what a healthy relationship was like. She never witnessed healthy boundaries. She never witnessed like what the things that would keep us from doing that, right? Like what healthy parenting is supposed to look like, how a healthy father is supposed to act in a child's life, or even as a husband. And so when she was faced with this situation of, do I go back to what I know, or do I keep pressing into the unknown and just hope that it gets better with no real idea of what that looks like? I mean, she chose what was familiar. And I think a lot of us do that. Maybe not in a situation this big and this difficult, but definitely even in our day to day, like little stuff, we tend to choose what's comfortable because that's what the brain likes. The brain likes what it knows. And so I wanted to give you guys that example, even though it's a little heavy, because I want you to understand that this is important and it does affect us. And this is what's the difference between those people who are able to change their lives and the people who get stuck in the one spot and just can't seem to get out. So, some other things that this could look like for you is more of maybe like a realistic example for just a person going through their life day to day. It may show up like chronic stress or chronic tension. Maybe relational struggles. So maybe you struggle in your friendships or in your marriage or with your kids. And maybe you find yourself like thinking, oh my gosh, I just sounded like my parent. Or, oh my gosh, that was something that like my parents would have done to me growing up. And, maybe you get into that spot where you're like, I'm being the person I said I was never going to be, or the parent I never wanted to be, or the spouse I never wanted to be, and you just kind of find yourself just going with the motions and kind of you taking those learned behaviors that maybe you didn't even realize you had learned and just running with them because that's what's there. And so if we don't interrupt that pattern and we don't stop that and we don't say, this is a result of my past and I want something different for my future, then we will just kind of keep going with it. And that is obviously not what we want to do. So, this can even show up as like hypervigilance or even like ADHD symptoms where we're like, we have these times where we're like super go, 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 like can't stay focused or I'm too focused, And so we can have those moments. And sometimes it even shows up as more of like what, the world would define it as bipolar, not necessarily what a psychologist would define as bipolar if they were like, actually going to do a diagnosis. But I think like when we look at social media and just online, what people think of as like bipolar tendencies doesn't exactly align with the exact diagnosis. But like those highs and lows that we see that seem kind of dramatic, sometimes those can show up in our day-to-day life. They can, because our mental health is affected by this. That's usually the most obvious thing, so it wasn't the first thing I pointed out, but obviously that is a big part, is like your mental health will be affected as you are going through these little and big traumas. And so we see that, and sometimes that comes with those highs and those lows of what can feel like almost like the bipolar tendencies of just like some days I feel great and I'm super high energy, and some days I feel really low. And just to kind of give you some peace if you are going through that, that doesn't necessarily mean that you know, need to get on meds or that you have some sort of, diagnosis that you haven't been like actually given yet. It could be that, like possibly, but more than likely, you're probably going through some sort of hormonal imbalance. And you can kind of look at that in your life and kind of assess that. Even if you just Google what are symptoms of a hormonal imbalance, I think that we find that a lot of us have that just because of all of the toxic stuff that's being put into our food, into our products. And so if you haven't kind of started to get aware of that, that's a good point to start. And so just to list off a few, I know for women, a big sign that you have hormonal imbalance is that your periods are irregular. So if that's you, then that might be the first thing you start working on, is just like getting your hormones healthy, getting your gut health healthy. And so for men, sometimes that looks like low libido, like you don't have as much of a sex drive as you used to, or maybe you're really starting to get like a beer gut or something, like you're starting to gain weight in the belly, and that was never an issue before. Those can be signs of hormonal imbalances. So I hope that that was helpful for you guys. And maybe in the future, I'll bring on like a specialist who can kind of talk to us more about how we heal our hormones and get healthy in that aspect. So, yeah, come over to the Facebook group and tell me if you want me to bring a specialist on to talk about that with us. All right, guys. And then going into our last point here, I just kind of wanted to tell you that trauma is not part of your identity. It's not part of like who you are, and it doesn't define what the rest of your life is going to look like. And so that's important to understand as we continue forward, because we need to be finding our identity in Jesus and Christ, in the Word, and not anywhere else, including within ourselves, right? So Satan is 100% going to try to whisper lies in your head that say you're not enough, you're not worthy, your trauma is changed you, it's made you less than it. It's an icky part of your life that you should be ashamed of it, and all those things. We all have different ones, but they seem to be on the same track, right? And I just want to remind you that while we can never be enough on our own, we don't have to be, because we have Jesus Christ and we have the Holy Spirit within us. And because we have the Holy Spirit, we are now enough, if that makes sense. Like, we have God within us, so we are not missing anything. And God doesn't make mistakes, so He didn't make a mistake in any part of how He made you. And so I just want you guys to know that while the Lord does call us to become better, right? And to have our hearts changed by Him and to surrender to Him so He can do the hard lifting, the real work on our hearts and minds. That's important. And there is two sides of it. There is like, you need to take steps and partner with God, right? Because the more you partner with Him, the more you surrender to Him, the more you step up and say, okay, God, I'm going to do your will, the faster that you can get to the results you're looking for. But also knowing that like you can't do it on your own, and there is work that has to be done within you by God. Like, He's the only one who can actually change your heart and actually change your mind. And so that's important to keep in mind, that like, some of it is just, we have to give it to God and let Him do it. So the last piece of homework that you guys need to do is to really journal out, or even just like have a conversation with God or with your spouse. Just kind of decide, what do you want your life to look like? Like, what do you want future you to look like? What is a version of you that is not living out of these trauma habits, these trauma patterns look like? And the reason you need to do this is because if you don't kind of define what you're wanting and what you want it to look like, then there's going to be no intentionality and no real purpose moving forward. So I can tell you all the information, but if you haven't decided what you want this to look like for you, then your brain is not going to take this seriously. You're not going to take this seriously. It'll just be another thing that gets set on a shelf and forgotten about. And I don't want that for you. So if you're really going to walk through this with me, if you're really going to do it, then do it right. And really think through what this is going to look like for you and what your goal to get out of this is. So I'm so excited for you guys. I'm so glad you're taking this step with me. And if you really if you're ready to take the next step outside of just listening to the podcast, which listening to the podcast is a great first step, but if you want to go beyond that, I do have a free anxiety workbook and audio training that can be used in a digital form, or you can print the workbook off and just listen to the audio training virtually. If you're like, yeah, I prefer to write, like physically write, which I totally get. And that is why we have our coaching curriculum in a physical book that you can tangibly hold in front of you, because yeah, it's so nice to actually have the physical copy. So I totally get that. And the other thing is, if you guys are ready to take the step beyond just the free stuff and you want to actually work with me one-on-one, the link is down in the show notes. Go and fill it out, and your first call is free, just to see if we're a good fit, and there's no strings attached, there's no pressure. Just go and fill it out. At the worst case scenario, you get some value from it and you walk away and you never have to talk to me again. And best case scenario, you love it and you learn a lot, and then we end up working together. So just take the step, apply for either, to coach with me or to get the free anxiety workbook, or both. And either way, I will continue to see you on the podcast. And I'm excited, guys. This series is going to be so good. So make sure that you've actually followed the show if you haven't already, because I want you guys to stay updated. So that's all I have for you today. And I hope that the rest of your day is wonderful. Bye.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope you got so much value out of it. And if you loved this episode, could you do me a quick favor and click 5 stars and leave me a review? It would do wonders for spreading the podcast out to other people who need it, and it only takes a few seconds. If you have an additional few seconds, why don't you go ahead and screenshot the episode and share it to your stories so we can spread the message and get more families healed. Thank you, and until next time, I will be praying for you, and I hope you have a blessed day. Bye.